They still talk, in that stretch of the Nebraska sandhills, about the winter a girl of 18 paid $10 for the dead saloon at the end of Ordway's one street. She had been put out of the only home she had with a grip in one hand and her whole fortune knotted in a stocking. No people, no prospects, no roof past that night. The saloon had stood dark since the cattle stopped shipping, its windows soaped, its bar gathering dust, and the men who watched her sign for it agreed among themselves that the child had thrown her last coin down a dry well. Not one of them guessed. Not one soul in that town had guessed in 26 years what stood waiting in the dark behind that long mahogany bar. If a story like this one finds something in you, do us the small kindness of subscribing and leave a comment telling us where in the world you're hearing it from. We never tire of watching how far these carry. The girl was called Temperance Fadley, Tempe, to the two people who had ever loved her, which struck everyone who met her as a joke the good Lord had told at her expense. A girl named Temperance buying a saloon. She'd been born above a watchmaker's shop in Grand Island, and that fact is the seed of the whole thing. Her father, Osgood Fadley, mended clocks and watches for the railroad town, and the shop below their rooms was a place of 1,000 small sounds, the tick of 40 movements at once, each at its own pace, the whir of a mainspring let down, the tiny music of a repeater struck to test its chime. Her mother had died of a burst appendix when Tempe was small, too young to leave the child more than a face half remembered, and a habit of humming, so it was Osgood and his daughter and the ticking shop, and that was her entire world. And it was enough. Here is the thing about Tempe, the thing that comes to matter. Where other children are frightened of the dark, or of dogs, or of strangers, Tempe as a girl was troubled by clocks that disagreed. She could not abide a room where two of them ran even a half-minute apart. She would go around at 5 years old with her father's smallest key and set them true to one another, all 40, until the shop ticked as a single heart, and only then could she sit still. Osgood found her at it one evening and did not laugh. He watched for a long moment, and then he said, half to himself, that the child had been born to keep time, to make the world agree with itself, and that God had best have work in mind for a soul built that particular way. Tempe was too young to know what he meant. The knowledge was a long way off. Osgood's eyes failed him slowly, the way a watchmaker's eyes do, the fine focus going first, so that the man who could once set a hairspring by feel was reduced, by the time Tempe was 15, to sorting parts by size in his palm, while his daughter did the close work under the loupe. She had his whole trade in her hands by then. And then his heart quit him one October night between one tick of the regulator on the wall and the next, there, and then simply not, and the shop below fell silent for the first time in her memory, every movement she hadn't wound. Running down one by one over the following days, until the last of them stopped, the shop was mortgaged. It went to the bank that held the paper, and a cousin of Osgood's from Kearney came and took what tools the bank didn't claim and left the girl with a grip and cold civility. And a girl of 15 with no people is a matter a town settles quickly. She was taken in by the family that ran the Grand Island Hotel, ostensibly as help, understood by all as charity, and there she scrubbed and carried and mended the guests' watches on the side for coins she hid away, and she kept her head down and her mouth shut, because a girl who makes noise in a house that grudges her the bed only teaches that house to want the bed back. But she found her way to the trade that would save her. There was an old man in Grand Island named Barnabas Klein. No, the town called him Klein the Clockman, a Bavarian who had built tower clocks in the old country before he crossed the water, and he still kept a bench, though his customers had mostly gone. Tempe went to him on her Sundays, and he took the time with her that the hotel family never would. He taught her past what her father had lived to teach. The depthing of gears, the poising of a balance, the making of a part from raw brass when no part could be bought, and the great slow logic of a tower movement where a fault the width of a hair at the escapement becomes a lie of 10 minutes at the hands. He taught her that a clock does not measure time so much as keep faith with it, tick after tick, whether anyone is watching or not. A clock is only a promise, he told her once, oiling a pallet with a needle's tip, a promise to go on keeping the count when the whole house has gone to bed. She did not grasp the whole of it then. She would, and it would cost her something to learn. Her coins went into a Raleigh's salve tin, the shallow round kind with the tin lid kept in the toe of a spare boot in the hotel attic. She had $40 in it by 17, near 55 by 18. And the week she turned 18, the hotel keeper's wife turned out the attic for spring cleaning and found the boot and the tin, and the row that followed was never truly about the money. It was about 3 years of a charity girl the house had never wanted, come suddenly to a head over a boot full of coin. By dark Tempe stood in the road with her grip and her salve tin and her father's own pocket watch, the one thing of his the bank had let her keep, and the door of her last shelter latched behind her for good, kicked out. 18 and nowhere, in the plain cold meaning of the words. It was old Klein who pointed her north and west. He had a nephew, he said, out in the sandhills, in a cattle town gone quiet called Ordway, and there was standing at the end of that town's street an old saloon shut up since the shipping pens emptied, and the county would let it go for the back taxes to anyone fool enough or brave enough to want it. If she wanted a wall to hang her bench on and a town with no clockman of its own, that was as good a place as any to begin. Tempe had not meant to go anywhere at all. But there is not much to weigh when everything you own fits in one hand, and so, at first light, she took northbound. The sandhills are a country that comes on you slowly, and then will not let your eye go. The flat farmland of the Platte gave way, mile on mile, to a great sea of grassed dunes rolling to every horizon, tan and green and endless, the wind writing long, shivering lines across the grass, the way a current writes on water. Cattle stood small and scattered on the far slopes. Blowout beardgrass hissed at the road's edge. The air smelled of cured hay and warm sand, and near the sloughs cupped low between the hills the green breath of water and the sudden, clean cold of a spring. A marsh hawk hung and tilted over a draw and let the coach roll past beneath it. Tempe took it all in with the still, gathering attention she gave to any mechanism she meant to understand, and though she had never once crossed those hills, their long, slow rhythm sat oddly easy in her, the way a strange movement will sometimes tick in your hand exactly as you'd have said it yourself. Ordway, at the end of the grade, was a town the cattle boom had raised, and the closing of the pens had hushed. One short street, half its false fronts blind and boarded, the loading chutes at the head of it gone gray and sway-backed. Klein's nephew met the coach, a broad, easy, quiet man named Ansel, who ran the town's little store and carried a map of every board and beam in that country behind his eyes, and who filled the walk down the street with almost no words at all and let the wide, sighing dusk speak instead. At the low end, where the street gave out to open grass, he stopped and lifted a hand toward the largest dark front on the row and said only, "Yonder, that's the one my uncle wrote me you'd come for." The saloon was a tall, deep, false-fronted building, put up in the flush years when Ordway meant to be a city. Good sawn pine over a heavy timber frame, a high-pressed tin ceiling gone to rust freckle, and running the length of the room a bar of dark mahogany that had come, Ansel said, all the way up the river and overland by wagon. A bar finer than the town had ever deserved. The roof leaked at the parapet where the flashing had let go. The floor was gray with grit. Behind the bar, the tall back bar rose to the ceiling, its great mirror clouded and freckled with age, and above its center, and this stopped Tempe where she stood, was set a clock. A saloon clock, an 8-day regulator in a walnut case, built into the back bar itself. Its hands stopped dead at some forgotten hour. Its pendulum hung still behind the dusty glass. The building was a wreck, but the frame stood honest, and the great bar was sound under its dust. And that stopped clock looked back at her across the ruined room like a thing that had been waiting a long time for someone who would know how to start it again. "Whose was it?" she asked. Ansel considered. "Belonged to a fellow named Lucius Thorne." "No." He frowned, corrected himself. "Lucius Varga. Kept it near 30 years. Through the shipping days when this street ran 3 deep of an evening, ran an honest house, which is rarer than you'd think. Watered nobody's whiskey, called time fair, kept the peace himself. In the winter the pens closed and the town fell quiet. No wife, no kin that ever surfaced. Counties had it for the taxes since." He glanced sidelong at her. $10 clears it. Nobody's wanted it in 26 years. Folks'll tell you a room that heard that many men's troubles keep a few of them on after." $10, said Tempe. $10, Ansel said, and a sight more work than one girl ought to shoulder by her lonesome. She laid it out the next morning on the county clerk's desk, $10 in mixed coin, shaken from the salve tin, and the clerk looked from the money to the slight girl in the too big coat and asked, not unkindly, if she was certain. Land didn't change hands for $10. $10 was a good winter's firewood, which left 2 possibilities only. Either someone had erred, or the place was so far beyond worthless that a quarter century of men had passed it by for free. It was what she had, Tempe told him, and it was what she wanted. And she signed the deed in the small, exact hand her father had trained into her over a repair ledger, and the clerk drew a heavy iron key from a drawer and set it before her, black and cold and long asleep. 26 years it had lain in that drawer, he said. Hers now. She closed her fingers on it, and the cold weight of it settled into her palm, like the first true fact of her life that no one could revise. Still here? Then do the one thing that keeps a channel like ours alive. Tap that subscribe before you go on. It's a small thing, and it means a great deal. She walked down to the saloon that same afternoon, with the iron key warming slowly in her fist, and her breath ghosting in the bright cold. The place, seen close, was a study in ruin laid over good work. Sand had sifted under the doors and lay in dunes along the baseboards. Birds had been in through the broken parapet. But when she set her shoulder to the bar and threw her weight against it, the great mahogany didn't so much as shift, bolted and braced by a joiner who'd built it to take the leaning of 1,000 men. She went the length and breadth of the room before she'd pass any judgment, sitting down the floor for its level, sounding the frame with the flat of her hand, checking, in the way old Klein had drilled into her at the tower clock bench, for the true structure beneath the fault. And the truth of the place was good. The builder had built it to last, whatever the years had done to its face. The lock had rusted itself shut across 26 winters, and for a bad moment the long key wouldn't turn at all. And she stood there, thinking she'd crossed a sea of grass to buy herself a door, and nothing behind it. She didn't fight it. She'd learned at the bench that force is the enemy of anything seized. A drop of oil from the little can she carried, a patient rocking of the key just shy of its bind, the way you'd coax a fused arbor to move again. And after a long minute the wards surrendered with a low iron cough, and the bolt drew back. The doors swung inward on shrieking hinges, 26 years of shut air breaking loose all at once, and the smell of the place rolled out to meet her, dust and sand and mouse, and under it, soaked into the very grain of the room, the ghost of spilled whiskey and pipe smoke and men. The smell is of 1,000 shut-down nights. She stood on the sill, with the low sun stretching her shadow the length of the plank floor, and then she went in. The room ran back long and dim to the great bar and its clouded mirror, the tables shrouded in dust, a scatter of chairs where men had risen and never come back, and over it all the stopped clock in the back bar keeping its silent broken vigil above the till. It was a ruin. It stood. It was hers. And turning slowly in the gray light, Tempe felt the outline of a whole life she hadn't dared imagine come down and settle over her. Quiet and exact, the way a movement settles into true, once the last wheel is finally seated. That first night, she slept on the soundboards near the cold stove, a small, careful fire drawn up in it, and the sandhills outside were loud with sounds no shop-raised girl had ever slept beside. The ceaseless combing of the wind through the grass, the yip of a coyote, and the answer from the next hill over, the small tickings and settlings of a big old building learning it wasn't empty anymore. Sleep was slow, but somewhere deep in the night, the fear thinned out and left behind a steadiness she hadn't felt in 3 years. The calm of a shop full of clocks all beating together at last, the feeling of a room and a life come into true time. She began at the back bar because the stopped clock had been calling to her since she crossed the sill, and because a clockmaker cannot leave a dead movement in a room and think of anything else. She meant only to see whether the works could be saved. She lifted the walnut hood from the movement and blew the dust from the plates and found the thing beautifully made and only run down. No break, no rust, just 30 years of stillness. And when she reached behind the movement to free the pendulum, her fingers found that the back of the clock's case did not close against the back bar the way it should. It stood off it, a hand's breadth hollow. She brought the lantern, and she saw that the whole clock case had been built out from the wall on purpose, a false depth behind the movement, and set into that false depth, flush and hidden, was a small locked door faced in the same walnut, invisible to anyone who did not take the clock apart to wind it. She sat back on the bar stool for a long moment in the lantern light. Then she went up the street and brought Ansel back, because there are some doors a person is right not to open alone. He studied the hidden panel behind the clockworks for a good while and rubbed his jaw. "Lucius Varga," he said quietly. A saloon keeper in a shipping town banked half the county over that bar, held a drover's wages so the faro table couldn't get them, staked a man to breakfast, kept more ready cash under his own floor than the bank 2 doors up ever saw. People always wondered where Varga's money went when he died looking poor. Nobody asked him to live. He wasn't a man to ask. He looked at the little walnut door behind the clock. "Reckon we've found where he kept it, and how, behind the one thing in this room nobody but a clockman would ever think to take apart." She worked the small lock with a pick bent from a mainspring the way Klein had taught her to open a case whose key was lost, and it gave, and the little walnut door swung open on a cavity, built into the thickness of the back bar behind the clock, bone dry, lined with zinc against the damp, and ranked inside it on a narrow shelf, stood on end like books, was a row of flat cash boxes, iron under black japanning, each with its small brass keyhole, and each, she saw as she brought the flame close, bearing a paper label gone amber with age, a year inked on every one. The nearest read 1863. Behind it the years stepped back into the dark, 1864, 1865, one box for every year the old man had stood behind that bar, a portion of each year's take shut away behind the clock, while the town outside forgot the room was there. She drew out the first box, heavy, that low, settled, unmistakable heaviness that is only ever metal, that the hand knows before the mind will credit it. She turned the little lock with the bent pick and lifted the lid. Coin, gold on top, laid in oiled paper gone stiff as horn. Eagles and half-eagles, the milling still sharp under the dust. Silver beneath them, dollars worn thin in the pockets of dead drovers. And under the coin, banded flat with twine, the paper money of the boom, drovers' scrip and greenbacks pressed together in bundles, box after box along that hidden shelf, one for each year the old man had called time fare and watered no one's whiskey, a little of every honest year set by behind the clock. Some boxes were heavy. The one marked 1874, a great shipping year, would scarcely shut. Some were nearly bare. 1867, a hard, dry, dying year, held 2 coins and a folded playing card, the ace of clubs, soft with handling. Near 30 of them, standing on the shelf like a run of ledgers. Near 30 years of a fair man quietly keeping something back. Tempe sat down on the bar stool with a gold eagle bright and cold in her palm, and something rose hard in her chest and stung behind her eyes, and she set her jaw and breathed slow through it until it passed, the way you steady your hand before the finest cut of all. Ansel said not a word. The moment didn't want words. Between them they counted the better part of 2 days, and when a straight-dealing coin man had come out on the mail wagon from the county seat and weighed the gold on his own balance and named her honest figures, the whole of it, gold and silver and scrip together, came to something over $10,000, more money than Temperance Fadley had let herself so much as dream of touching in the whole span of a life. And even so, it was not the money that undid her. In the last box, the low one at the shelf's far end, beneath the final fold of oiled paper, lay a flat packet, and inside it a small sheaf of old bar chits tied with waxed thread, and one sheet folded twice on itself, its wax seal cracked with the years, marked across the face in a broad, plain hand, for the one who stops to wind the clock. Tempe broke the last of the wax, with fingers that would not quite hold their steadiness, and unfolded it and read it there at the bar by the swinging lantern. "My name is Lucius Varga," it began. "I was born in the Banat, in the old country, in the year 1830, and I came across the water a young man with strong arms, a fair mind, and not a coin to bless myself. I opened this house in 1862, and I stood behind this bar the better part of 30 years. And in all that, while I never watered a man's glass, nor shorted his change, nor called time a minute early on a soul, which is a thing I hold above every dollar behind that clock, whatever the town made of a keeper who died looking poor. Whoever you are, read this by whatever light. The money behind the clock is no treasure. It never once was. It is only what I could not bring myself to spend, laid by a little at a time, and it did me not 1 hour of good shut behind the works while I grew old and alone in front of them. I always told myself I kept it against some better day. In 30 years I never named the day. There is my whole error, set down plain, and I have had a long time in this emptied town to learn it letter by letter. I stood in this room every night and gave 400 men a warm lamp and a fair glass and a friendly hour, and I kept the time for the whole of Ordway on that clock behind me, called the hours and closed the house by it faithful as a church bell, and I never once let my own clock run for me. I kept faith with everyone's time but mine. I minded the count for 400 men and let my own hours run down to nothing in the dark, like a movement nobody thought to wind. Do not do as I did. Do not keep the world's time so carefully that you forget to live on your own. You came into my house for a reason, whoever you are. Perhaps you wanted a place to stand at last. Perhaps you were building toward a thing you couldn't yet name. Perhaps you were only lost, as I was lost, and stayed lost far longer than a soul ought. I was every one of those, once. I hope this serves you as I never let it serve me. The coin is not the point of the thing. It was never more than the key that turns the lock. What counts is the door it opens, and that you walk through it and wind your own clock and let it run. The house is honest and well-framed, and she'll stand another 100 winters if you keep her roof sound and her clock going. Some houses are like that. Some lives could be, if only we'd let them. Lucius Varga, his own hand. In the spring of 1876, Temp read it through twice. Then she folded it small and held it a while in her lap in the cold hush of the room the old man had kept and died alone inside, and her mind went walking. To a shop full of 40 clocks all beating as one heart above a Grand Island street, to a girl of 5 going round with a key setting them true because she could not bear a room where the time disagreed. To old Klein, with his oiling needle saying a clock is a promise to keep the count after the house has gone to bed. And it went to Lucius Varga, 26 years in the ground, the fair keeper, who had minded a whole town's hours and let his own run out, who had died alone above a fortune he never let himself want and left the finding of it to whichever soul finally stopped to wind his clock. And she understood, sitting there, the thing she would carry to the last of her days, that the coin behind the works was the smallest part of what the old man had left her. He'd left her a clock to keep going, and a warning, and a life to wind. The gold had never been the gift. The gift was the turning key, and the door past it, and the leave to begin. By the following summer the saloon was a different building, and Temperance Fadley was a different woman. She did the work the way old Klein had drummed into her. A thing set right the once will outrun a thing set fast a dozen times. A little of the gold went to the labor, the rest she banked at the county seat, and drew on only as the building asked. She had the failed parapet flashing torn out and relaid in bright soldered tin, so the wet could never work in there again. She swept out the drifted sand by the bushel, glazed the broken front windows, and scrubbed the great mahogany bar back through a quarter-century of grime to the deep red heart of the wood, and oiled it till it glowed like a chestnut. She had the clouded back bar mirror re-silvered by a man in the county seat who did such work, and, when it came back and she hung it, the long room doubled itself in bright glass for the first time in 26 years. But the first thing she truly finished, before any of the rest, was the clock. She cleaned every wheel and pivot, poised the balance, rebushed the worn holes, hung the pendulum, and wound the 8-day movement full, and it caught, and it ran, and its slow, steady tick filled that dead room like a pulse coming back into a body that had lain too long still. She did not turn the place into a saloon again. There was no shipping trade left to slake, and a girl named Temperance keeping a bear room was a joke she declined to be the butt of. She made it a clock shop and a good deal more. The only clockmakers for 60 miles of grass, with the long mahogany bar for her counter and workbench, and the great mirror throwing daylight onto her loop. She kept the clock behind the bar, exactly where Varga had built it, and its hidden door behind, though now the little cavity held only her spare mainsprings and the old man's letter. She kept one empty cash box, too, the one marked 1862, the year he opened the house, and stood it on the bar-back shelf, with the letter folded inside, beside her father's own pocket watch, the 2 timepieces keeping company. She hadn't made the room over. She'd brought it back to true, and those are different things, as different as a clock stopped and a clock running. Ordway warmed to her, the slow way sandhill towns do, which is to say by seasons rather than by weeks. A curiosity first, then a nod, then the plain unspoken day when she was simply one of theirs, which is the dearest thing such people hand across, and the last to be given. Ansell's wife, a spare, quick woman named Kayfield, took to carrying up a covered dish of runza and cabbage on a Sunday, and would hear nothing of paying for it. "You eat, Liebling," she'd say. "These winters take the meat right off the body." An old windmill man named Dawkin, who'd greased the pump mills all his life and known Lucius Varga to nod good evening to, took to the chair by her stove of an evening and gave her the man in pieces. The seamstress 2 towns over he'd courted a decade by post and never once gone to see, the deaf old barroom cat named Pilsner that had slept the length of that bar for years and lay now under the cottonwood by the horse trough. Tempe wrote some of it down in a small book she kept in the box on the shelf, drawing the outline of a man she never met from the leaves that outlasted him, and she opened her doors. Not to whiskey and faro, but to the whole clock-starved county, for the town, she found, had gone 26 years without a soul to mend a movement, and its clocks and watches had been running down one by one all that while, 100 small hearts stopping across the sandhills, for want of a hand to wind and mend them. They came from the far ranches and the buried little towns with grandfather clocks that hadn't struck since the war and railroad watches run to ruin, and their dead mothers' brooch watches stopped at some hour that had come to mean too much to let go. And Tempe took each one and opened it under the loop and read the true fault beneath the fault, and set the count going again, and handed back to a rancher or a widow or a boy the small ticking miracle of time restored, and refused always to shade a repair or overcharge a hard-up hand, fair as old Varga had ever called a fair glass. Some of what people brought her was past all saving. She told them so gently, and did what could be done, because a clockmaker who won't try for a stopped heart is in the wrong trade, and she did the one thing the old man never had. Every night when the county's clocks were mended and the shop was swept, Tempe wound the great clock behind the bar, and then she wound her father's pocket watch, and then this was the whole of it. She sat a while in her own lit room and let her own hours run for no one but herself. Not the town's time, not 400 men's time, hers. The one clock Lucius Varga, in 30 years, had never let himself keep. On an evening late in a golden summer, she sat on the front step she'd rebuilt with her own hands and watched the light run long and amber across 100 miles of grass, the old barroom cat's grand kitten drowsing warm against her leg, and she turned the whole of it over. Her father, who had made a Grand Island Street run on time and showed her the shape of her life before she could read it. Old Klein with his oiling needle, who had taught her that a clock is a promise to keep the count after the house is abated. And Lucius Varga, 26 years under the cottonwood-shaded ground, who had kept a whole town's time faithful and let his own run down to silence, and learned the last plain thing too late for it to save him, and left it behind the clock for whoever came. There is a pull in a few of us that runs deeper and quieter than any reason we could give for it, older than the words we'd use to name it. We cannot always say why we want the thing we want, nor where the wanting means to carry us. But it is real that pull, and far enough it tends, in the end, to set a person down somewhere. For some, somewhere is a place they were born into. For others, it is a place they must cross a country to find. A sea of grass, a shrieking door, a false depth behind a stopped clock that a whole town swore for a quarter-century was nothing but a clock. What the place is does not matter at all. What matters is whether you can stand inside it, wind the works, and hear your own hours begin to beat again in true time. Something that says, tick after tick, without a word. This is the place. This is where I begin. Temperance Fadley was 18 years old and put out with nowhere to go. $10 knotted in a stocking to her name, and she spent it on a dead saloon a whole town swore was worthless. Best $10 she ever laid down, and not, when the count was finally taken, for the coin behind the clock. For the door that key unlocked, and the works she set going again, and the hours she finally, in a lonely old man's memory, let run for herself. If this one moved you tonight, subscribe to the channel and send it on to someone whose own clock could use winding just now. And tell us down in the comments whose time you have been keeping so faithfully that you've let your own run down. We read every last one, and we'd love to hear it. See you in the next one.